All right, everyone. I think we're going to go ahead and get started. Welcome back to the National Trust for Historic Preservation's Forum webinar series. My name is Pam Bowman, and I am Senior Director of Government Relations at the National Trust. It's great to be with all of you for today's conversation. If this is your first time joining the webinar series, Preservation Leadership Forum is the professional membership program of the National Trust for Historic Preservation. This webinar series is made possible by members of the Preservation Leadership Forum, and we sincerely thank all of the members who are joining us today. Before we begin, here are a few logistics for our conversation. We will have a Q&A segment following today's presentations. And to make sure the panelists see your questions, please share them throughout the webinar via the Q&A function so our speakers receive them directly. The closed captioning function is enabled for this webinar. You can enable it and disable it either through the controls at the bottom of your screen or through your audio settings. Following the webinar, we will send out a recording to the email address you used during registration, and this and all Preservation Leadership Forum webinars are available on our YouTube channel. And finally, as a reminder, we ask that everyone is respectful to each other in the chat and follow our code of conduct. Next slide, please. I am pleased to be joined today by a fantastic group of speakers, including my National Trust colleagues Lauren Cohen and Chris Cody, and also Evan Johnston joining us from the Congressional Office of Representative Shelley Pingree. We're glad you're with us today, and we look forward to sharing our insights and perspectives with you. Next slide. This year promises to be a significant year for historic preservation and many of the key policy issues of the preservation community. Along with the nation's semi-quincentennial, 2026 also marks anniversaries for the National Historic Preservation Act and Historic Preservation Fund, along with the centennial celebration for historic Route 66. And in each of these areas and beyond, we have an opportunity to continue engaging with our communities and elected officials to share the importance of historic preservation. During today's presentations, our speakers will be sharing updates and information that we hope will be helpful to your work, and also highlight opportunities for your continued engagement on preservation issues. We're going to begin the discussion today on federal funding for preservation, including the funding landscape and appropriations. And as a follow-up to our November webinar last year, you're going to hear more about the importance of the National Historic Preservation Act and Section 106 process, as well as updates and recent developments for critical policy issues in this area. We will also briefly cover a series of updates and advocacy opportunities for pending federal legislation and ways that you can be engaged. Before we get to Q&A at the end, we will also highlight an additional webinar taking place this afternoon. We'll put a link in the chat for that second webinar, which will take place at 4:30 p.m. Eastern today, and hope that you'll be able to join us. I am now going to turn it over to my colleague Lauren Cohen from our Government Relations team for the discussion on federal funding. Lauren?
Great. Thank you very much, Pam. My name is Lauren Cohen. I'm the Director of Government Relations with the National Trust for Historic Preservation, and I'm so thrilled to be with you here today to talk about the federal funding landscape for preservation initiatives for this coming year. Now, as a reminder, we are in the second year of the 119th Congress. That means that work that started last year in 2025 is continuing over this year in 2026. So everything we're going to be talking about here today is within legislatively is within the same Congress. But starting off with the federal funding landscape, I just want to show you that this chart that you're seeing here on the screen goes over all of the ways that the federal government invests in historic preservation and other related areas in our federal government. So at the end of January, Congress finalized action on fiscal year 2026 appropriations, passing the bill and sending it to the president, all but one of the spending bills. We are currently in a partial shutdown for one spending bill. However, the president signed all those other ones into law, including the Interior Appropriations Bill. This is the measure that funds virtually all of the federal historic preservation programs and all the ones that you see here on the screen. So I'd like to go over a few high-level takeaways from the fiscal year 2026 appropriations and how that wrapped up before I jump into what we're looking at for fiscal year 2027. So first, the standout for our work reflected in this funding bill was the Historic Preservation Fund. The HPF received approximately $181 million, up from $169 million in fiscal year 2025. That's about a 7% increase. Now, while this remains below the program's FY23 high water mark of $204 million, it's a meaningful boost. Notably, the final number exceeded both the House and the Senate initial proposals and represented a roughly 93% increase over what the president's budget request initially was, which was only $11 million to support just one of the competitive grant programs. So that's a huge win for the Historic Preservation Fund to see any kind of increase in this environment. Second, I'll point out that the Advisory Council on Historic Preservation faced headwinds throughout the process. After a significant proposed reduction in the president's budget request and similar posture in the House-passed interior bill, the final enacted level reflects about a $300,000 decrease. Now, while this isn't as severe as initially proposed, it is still a cut for the ACHP, and that'll have real implications for the capacity in that agency. Finally, you'll note here on the chart that many of the accounts you see here remained flat. This includes level funding for the National Endowment for the Humanities, National Endowment for the Arts, National Heritage areas. And in a constrained budget environment, flat funding is often viewed as a defensive win, but it doesn't keep pace with rising costs and growing demand. So taken together, fiscal year 2026 was largely a year of stabilization, but with a significant bright spot for the Historic Preservation Fund that reflects continued bipartisan support for preservation at the federal level. Next slide, please. Now, with that in mind, I want to turn to fiscal year 2027 and the outline that we have for appropriations agenda for the year ahead. So FY 2027 will be an extraordinary and symbolic year for historic preservation. Pam already mentioned the anniversaries we're looking at, but the nation will mark its 250th anniversary, and our shared history will be front and center for policymakers and the public alike. So in recognition of that milestone, we are joining our national preservation partners and calling for $250 million for the Historic Preservation Fund. This is, to be candid, an ambitious request, particularly in a tight fiscal environment. But we believe that this moment presents a unique opportunity to build broader and even new bipartisan support for federal investment in preservation. Anniversaries like this often create visibility, and visibility can create opportunity. For the past 3 fiscal years, we've consistently advocated for $225 million for the Historic Preservation Fund to better align funding with demonstrated needs of the preservation field in SHPO and TIPO offices and those competitive grant programs. The additional $25 million, up from $225 million the past 3 fiscal year asks to $250 million. That additional $25 million in our FY27 request would be a one-time targeted investment to support the survey and digitization of historic resources nationwide. This is not simply about documentation. Expanded survey and digitization would elevate lesser known and underrepresented histories, strengthen local planning efforts, and help streamline Section 106 and other review processes, creating greater efficiency and predictability in permitting. In other words, it's both a cultural investment and a practical one. And it's worth underscoring just how significant this year will be. In addition to the nation's 250th anniversary, fiscal year 27 also holds the 60th anniversary of the National Historic Preservation Act, the 50th anniversary of the Historic Preservation Fund, and the 100th anniversary of Route 66, which you'll hear more about later in the webinar. These milestones offer a rare alignment of history, policy, and great momentum. Next slide, please. I want to close by flagging a few issues that we're actively watching because appropriations is only part of the story here. Implementation of those appropriated funds and authorization matter just as much. So let's first talk about disbursement. As many of you experienced firsthand, fiscal year 2025 Historic Preservation Fund dollars were significantly delayed in reaching SHPOs and TIPOs. That created real uncertainty for staffing, project planning, and grants management on the ground. Representative Shelley Pingree of Maine, who you see pictured here, led pointed efforts in committee hearings, raising these delays directly with Secretary Burgum and Director of the Office of Management and Budget Vogt. And she pressed for clarity on the administration's timeline and intent, and we appreciate her efforts there. As fiscal year 2026 funds have been signed into law, as I mentioned in January, we're watching very closely to ensure that those delays are not repeated from last year. Timely disbursement is not a technical issue. It is essential to keeping the preservation infrastructure functioning nationwide. Second thing I'll note too is we're watching for authorization. The Historic Preservation Fund has now received 1-year extensions in each of the past 3 appropriations bills, while the authorization for its annual deposits expired a few years ago. While we're grateful for this fix through the appropriations bill, this patchwork approach creates uncertainty and makes long-term planning difficult. The question for fiscal year 2027 is whether Congress will once again have to rely on short-term extensions like this, or whether we can finally secure a fuller long-term reauthorization. And finally, we're closely monitoring the upcoming fiscal year 2027 President's budget request. As I mentioned earlier, the administration proposed just $11 million for the HPF for fiscal year 2026, effectively a near elimination of the program's funding. But the president's budget request is just that, a request. Congress ultimately rejected that proposal in a bipartisan way with the leadership of Congresswoman Pingree shown here in her subcommittee. But it was a stark reminder that the executive branch requests do matter, and they can be a symbolic line in the sand for some. So we are preparing for multiple scenarios for fiscal year 2027. Could the administration again propose a drastic reduction? Possibly. But we also know that strong bipartisan support in Congress has made a difference before. In short, our work in fiscal year 2027 will focus not only on securing robust funding levels, but also ensuring timely implementation of those funds and stable authorization to back for the federal preservation partnerships. Now, I'm especially pleased to welcome Evan Johnston, who is the Deputy Chief of Staff and Legislative Director to Congresswoman Shelley Pingree. The Congresswoman represents Maine's 1st Congressional District and serves as ranking member of the Interior Appropriations Subcommittee, a subcommittee she has long served on. She is also a consistent champion for historic preservation priorities and is a member of the Historic Preservation Caucus, as well as the co-chair of the Congressional Arts Caucus and a member of the Congressional Humanities Caucus. So our guest today is Evan, and she is a Maine native and has worked for Representative Pingree in various roles since 2014. Fun fact, I also started on Capitol Hill in 2014, though Evan clearly has the stamina for the fast pace of the Hill that I did not. So if we can take the slides down, please. And Evan, if you'd like to come on camera. But Evan brings a deep understanding of both the policy and political dynamics shaping priorities on Capitol Hill. And we're grateful for the opportunity to hear directly from someone working at the very center of these discussions about how preservation champions can be most effective in this environment. So welcome, Evan. Thank you for being with us today.
Hi, Lauren. Such a kind introduction. Thank you so much. And thank you to everyone who's joining. You're doing very important work here.
Thank you. Thank you. So let's look at the big picture here.
Mm-hmm.
What's the mood around interior appropriations for this coming year? Are things feeling more predictable, or are we kind of bracing for another bumpy ride? What can you tell us?
Such a great question. As you said, I'm a little bit crazy. I've been on the Hill for really long time. And I've learned over that stretch not to make too many bets about what's going to happen here. It's always a bit of a roller coaster ride. Um, that being said, I know, and you covered this well, in your introduction, but FY26 was a really rough year. I know it was for many people on the call and many of your organizations and institutions. I think there was a lot of uncertainty that we all spent a lot of time and energy trying to work through. Um, and, despite all of that, through all of that, um, we have been able to come to reasonably bipartisan agreements on 11 out of our 12 appropriations bills, including Interior. And that is no small thing, right? Getting Congress to agree on anything, let alone 11 bills right now is I think a pretty fair blueprint for how we might be able to get FY27 done. So, and that is all, to say too that the FY26 bill was certainly not the bill that my boss would have written. Not a perfect outcome. I know there's so much more that we can do, but that is our goal, especially in this current Congress being made up as it is, and with our current administration, getting through FY27 with the agencies and programs that we care about mostly intact. I mean, you talked about level funding as sort of a defensive win, and I think that's exactly the right way to put it. We want these agencies to live to fight another day, and I think that will be our goal headed into this season. And we'll fight for every possible kind of increase and victory that we can with the resources that are given to us as a subcommittee. It's anyone's guess what the dynamics will be like this fall. I think it's quite likely that we'll need at least one CR to get us through election season. And then we can sort of reassess how we might be able to negotiate those full year bills later in November or December, most likely.
That's a great point, Evan. This being an election year, that does mean little less time for legislation to happen and deals to be made on Capitol Hill. So that is good for us to remember.
Yeah.
So
I will
ahead.
just say, just today, the majority sent out our kind of directions for each member office to send in priorities in terms of FY27 spending. So we are getting kicked off just like normal. And, like I said, we'll see where we land, but things are getting started.
Gotcha. Okay. Well, that's a good segue into my next question. When you talk about members sending in their own priorities, Interior, it's Interior, Environment, and Related Agencies. That's the full name of this bill. That is such a sprawling bill. There's so much that's contained in that. And the funding chart I showed at the beginning was just a small snapshot of all the many things that are in this bill. So when everything feels really important, there's so many priorities and so many ways that your boss shows up in various ways. I mentioned her leadership in the Congressional Arts Caucus and participation in the Humanities Caucus and the Preservation Caucus. There's so many things. When everything feels important, how do members decide kind of what rises to the top for them in terms of priorities to fight for?
That's a great question and something we wrestle with a lot. Like you said, our bill has a pretty wide remit, everything under Department of Interior, EPA, and under Department of Interior, including Bureau of Indian Affairs, Bureau of Indian Education. We also have Indian Health Service, and then a wide range of cultural agencies like the endowments and Smithsonian and National Gallery. So yes, it's a lot to keep tabs on, and certainly we're limited as a subcommittee by kind of the overall top line number that we get. that's the kind of total amount of money that we have to spend within our bill. And in recent years, as you can imagine, we have not necessarily gotten a significant increase in that top line number. And so that leads to tough decisions. And of course, as you say, leads to member offices trying to be thoughtful and strategic about how we fight for the things that we care the most about. I think that a lot of what we try to focus on is unmet need, right? So especially when we have just a little bit to divvy up, we're looking at where can this small amount of increase that we have do the most good and help, clear the most roadblocks, right? We're also very much looking at kind of major projects and activities. So America 250 is a great example of that. And that has been a feature of some of the work done by NPS and cultural agencies. We certainly, I think, have some oversight to do on that, but it is still, I think, an important argument for those agencies being well staffed and well funded over the next year or two. We're also trying to be mindful about infrastructure needs, right? And I mean that kind of in specific ways and broad ways. Specifically, we're thinking about any kind of major needs that each agency might have in order to keep moving. Like the example that sticks in my head right now is, Indian Health Service has been working on an electronic health service, electronic health records project for a couple of years, right? So we're thinking about, okay, that project is ongoing. What do they need to make sure we're not kind of stopping them in their tracks? And then, thinking about historic preservation, we're of course, still in our kind of IIJA world where, there are federal resources, not as many as we pass or have hoped, but I know that there are still, long lists of projects that are being worked through as a result of some of that federal legislation providing resources. So, want to think about what the kind of structural infrastructure that's needed in order to make sure that all the rest of our priorities are moving smoothly.
Gotcha. Yeah, that's a great point. Well, my last question is just going to focus on really advocacy generally. So this is we always talk about like this is fly-in season in Washington D.C. Like every spring, you see hundreds of interest groups coming to Washington to meet with folks like you on the Hill to talk about what's important to them. I know we have friends who are doing Museums Advocacy Day this week, and I think the Libraries Advocacy is on the Hill, and then next week is Preservation Advocacy Week. So we've got a lot of engaged advocates on the call who may or may not be coming to Washington, D.C., maybe doing kind of more virtual advocacy. So, if advocates could do one thing differently this year to be more helpful to the offices of the members who represent them, what would you suggest?
That is a really good question. It's one of my favorite times of year. It's a little bit nuts, but I do get to see all my favorite people who come down from Maine, and we get to check in. So I love that. Just a warning, please bear with your friendly neighborhood congressional staff. We are doing our best to get through.
Get ready for some meetings in the hallways.
Inbox. Yes. I love Advocacy Week. My biggest suggestion is that you make sure that it's not just Advocacy Week when you're checking in with your delegation, right? There are a million different things going through my head in March, but times like July or August tend to be a little bit quieter. And they're certainly quieter up in our district office too. So I think my best suggestion is building relationships with these offices and these members so that I know if a preservation issue comes up, I know I can, reach out to our SHPO or Maine Preservation or whoever it might be, who might have good insight on that. And just being the person that your congressional staffer thinks of when they have a question, I think can go a long way with folks. And then I'd also just totally recommend having, as much as you can, kind of real on the ground examples that you're bringing to these offices, right? Data absolutely helps, numbers help, but the thing that I know my boss values the most is when we're talking about something that can be pretty abstract, like funding for a particular program or account. Her being able to keep in her mind, like, oh, with more funding, I know that we'll be able to potentially move faster on a couple of different projects across the district. Just having that kind of tangible way to think about the issue and talk about that issue with other people, whether that's her colleagues or folks back in Maine, makes a huge difference.
That's a fabulous point, and one really, really good for historic preservationists, because we have the benefit of having these tangible, incredible places that we want to save. So everybody knows that historic place in their hometown or their state that they love, and that's a good thing to point to. So all really great tips, Evan. Thank you so much for joining us. And thank you for all that you're doing for the Congresswoman, and please do thank her for her championing our stuff.
Absolutely. We're happy to continue to be a resource, and Lauren knows how to get in touch if anybody needs some help.
Awesome. Great. Thank you, Evan.
Thank you all.
Now I will pass it off to my colleague, Chris Cody, who will cover the legal preservation framework and its outlook for the rest of this year. Chris.
Thank you very much for that introduction, Lauren. So as Lauren said, my name is Chris Cody. I'm Senior Associate General Counsel at the National Trust, and I'm going to highlight a couple federal matters that the National Trust Law Division is working very closely with government relations on currently, and things that we anticipate being significant issues for us in the coming year. First, on January 30th, ACHP Vice Chair Travis Boyles sent an email to ACHP members announcing a new ACHP initiative to amend the Section 106 regulations, which are at 36 CFR 800. Vice Chair Boyles specifically asked ACHP members to consider how the Section 106 regulations might be modified, clarified, and streamlined to better accomplish the statutory objectives and requirements of the National Historic Preservation Act. Vice Chairman Boyles cited the October 29th, 2025 Senate Committee on Energy and Natural Resources hearing on Section 106 as one of the reasons for this initiative, but he also noted that it has been 22 years since the Section 106 regulations were updated. Vice Chairman Boyles also identified 4 key issues for ACHP members to consider that are based on the concerns expressed by senators during the Senate committee hearing. Those are: 1, defining the undertaking and establishing the area of potential effects; 2, assessing indirect and cumulative effects; 3, managing the review or scope of review for long linear projects with limited federal involvement; and 4, managing timelines for review. The National Trust will be submitting our initial comments on this initiative to the ACHP this Friday, and we've also requested to be a part of the ACHP members' working group for this project. Along with the 4 issues identified by the Vice Chair, there are several other updates to the Section 106 regulations that the National Trust has long advocated for that we hope will be included in any regulatory revisions. Things like clarifying the identification of the lead federal agency for multi-jurisdictional projects. Any proposed changes to the Section 106 regulations would ultimately have to go through the formal rulemaking process, which includes opportunities for public comment. So stay tuned for more information about this very important ACHP initiative and for more information about potential public comment opportunities in the future. Next slide, please. Another significant federal issue that we're engaged with is the new proposed Army program comment. While the Army has proposed and been granted several program comments by the ACHP before, this one is different. This proposed program comment scope would include all of the Army's historic resources, one of the largest portfolios of historic resources in the federal government, including over 122,000 historic buildings, over 84,000 historic archaeological sites. And the Army also estimates that an additional 300,000 plus new historic resources will come under their control in the coming years, bringing the total to over 500,000 historic resources that would be affected by this comprehensive program comment. The program comment would end all Army Section 106 consultation on future undertakings, which would also eliminate all opportunities for public comment, including for local and state governments. It would also allow the Army to electively apply the Secretary of Interior standards at their discretion, ending their mandatory compliance with this most crucial federal preservation standard. The Army also proposes that this program comment would be of unlimited duration. And the National Trust is opposed to all of these provisions, and we see them as substantial diminutions of the protections afforded to historic resources by the National Historic Preservation Act. There are two additional controversial provisions in this program comment. One would authorize the Army to terminate all 115 of its existing installation level Section 106 agreement documents, which is legally questionable because those agreement documents are binding contracts that typically have specific termination clauses. The program comment would also empower the chair of the ACHP to unilaterally extend the program comment to other military departments, potentially adding hundreds of thousands more historic resources to the scope of this program comment, including incredibly important historic places like Pearl Harbor. Given that the program comment doesn't have any information about any of the other military departments' historic resources or their capacity to implement the program comment, and given that the Section 106 regulations only empower the council to grant program comments, this provision is also legally questionable. So overall, the National Trust is seriously concerned by this program comment, both because of its unprecedented scope and scale, the precedent that it could set, and also because of the legal questions that it raises. The ACHP was asked to vote on adopting this program comment on February 12th, but chose to delay that vote by 45 days to allow for more time to review recent revisions. So this is an ongoing issue, and please stay tuned for more. We will let the public know how the ACHP votes, and we'll consider other actions at that point. Next slide, please. The National Trust is also closely monitoring the deaccessioning of an unprecedented number of significant federally owned historic buildings. When federally owned historic buildings are sold, the General Services Administration, or GSA, is required to establish a preservation easement or covenant to ensure the building's continued preservation. Despite their staff having been reduced significantly in the last year and the incredible volume of work that they're facing, I'm very pleased to share that the GSA staff has so far been very effective at fulfilling this obligation. The image in the top right of this slide is of the old post office in Washington, D.C., which is currently in the deaccessioning process and will be protected by a preservation easement. The image of the bottom right is a mural from the Cohen or Voice of America building, which has been called the Sistine Chapel of the New Deal for its incredible collection of murals. The bottom center image is the massive housing and urban development building in Washington, D.C., and bottom left is the historic Federal Customs House in downtown Charleston, South Carolina. All of these buildings and many more are in some stage of the deaccessioning process, and the National Trust is very closely monitoring the status of all of these transactions, including participating in Section 106 consultations for some of them. And again, so far, GSA has been doing a fantastic job. We expect this work will continue throughout the coming year as there are more significant historic buildings slated to be sold by the federal government. So again, stay tuned. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Chris, for that excellent presentation and update on several key issues related to NHPA and Section 106. We also wanted to share some brief information about ongoing and emerging preservation issues within the legislative landscape, and I will start with permitting reform, which is closely related to many of the developments that Chris mentioned. Chris also noted that last October, the Senate Energy and Natural Resources Committee held a hearing that focused on NHPA and the Section 106 process. And this began a several-week stretch beginning that month of a sharp uptick and sustained interest from members of Congress in NHPA, the Section 106 process, and exemptions. And that hearing was highly significant due to it being the first time in many years that Congress had dedicated a full hearing to examining NHPA and Section 106, with much of this interest connected with the issue of permitting reform. And as a preservation policy issue, this very broadly refers to the federal permitting process for a wide range of projects. This can be anything from pipeline construction or highway projects to oil and gas development and beyond. And these projects have the potential to impact historic resources, which is why the National Trust and our partners are closely following legislative proposals and committee activity on Capitol Hill that opens up the possibility for changes to the NHPA. Permitting reform has emerged as a high priority bipartisan issue as Congress is exploring ways to expedite both non-renewable and renewable energy projects nationwide. In the 118th Congress alone, between 2023 and 2024, we saw over 20 bills on this issue be introduced by members on the House and Senate side. And with so many of these legislative proposals emerging not only in the last Congress, but also with several more in the works during this Congress, all signs have pointed to additional attempts for the House and Senate to agree upon a permitting reform legislative package. We did cover this topic during our previous webinar in November, so we won't duplicate our more detailed content on today's session. We can drop a link in the chat for that webinar recording in case you weren't able to join us. But I did want to share one update since that webinar. And we were discussing permitting reform legislation and the SPEED Act in particular. And that update is that the House passed that legislation in December, just before the holidays. And we did want to note that while the SPEED Act has passed the House, there's not a companion bill in the Senate. We have seen that Senate leaders, including the chairman of the Senate Energy and Natural Resources Committee, have signaled that a legislative proposal is forthcoming. But those conversations continue about how they can reach agreement on the provisions. And any differing House and Senate proposals would likely need to be negotiated as one combined piece of legislation. Despite some of the variables and uncertainty about how the permitting reform could move forward. Our deep engagement on this issue is going to continue this year as we take the opportunity to educate lawmakers and their staff about the importance of the NHPA and other bedrock laws. We will be continuing to share updates and resources that we've produced. This will include our webinar content, any congressional testimony, and other comments, as we're all collectively ensuring that the importance of NHPA is effectively conveyed to decision makers. Another top priority for our legislative work this year is a bill that would designate Route 66 as a National Historic Trail. This campaign comes with two key milestones in 2026. First, we've already mentioned it's the 100th anniversary of Route 66 and its centennial celebration. Second, this marks the first time for bipartisan, bicameral matching legislation, which will significantly improve the chances of passage this year. We've listed the bill numbers here for both the House and Senate legislation. We also have some information just added to the chat about a place on our website where you can send a letter to your members of Congress asking that they join as a co-sponsor of the legislation. And while co-sponsorship from any representative or senator would be very helpful to help us get this passed, in particular, we're hoping to secure support from as many of the congressional offices in the 8 Route 66 states that are listed on your screen. And having as many of those as possible will help increase the chances of this getting done during the centennial year. We do have that strong message for getting this across the finish line and hope that you all will join us in help making that happen. We also want to call your attention to another piece of legislation called the America the Beautiful Act in the Senate. The National Trust has long supported efforts to address deferred maintenance at National Park Service sites as part of both our appropriations and other advocacy work. We worked alongside many partners as one of the lead organizations helping to secure passage of a bill called the Great American Outdoors Act. And just over 5 years ago, it was also considered one of the single greatest investments in public lands in our generation and provided several $billions for repairing historic NPS assets that are at risk of permanent damage or loss. That legislation was endorsed and enacted by President Trump in his first term. And the America the Beautiful Act would reauthorize the fund that was included in the Great American Outdoors Act to address deferred maintenance at public lands agencies by providing $16 billion over 8 years. We are already seeing substantial bipartisan support in the Senate for this bill, with 21 Republicans, 21 Democrats, and 1 independent supporting the legislation. And several senators have indicated their intention to push for passage during this calendar year. And so similar to Route 66, there's some information in the chat where you can visit our website, add your voice to this important issue, and send that letter to your senators if they've not already joined as a co-sponsor. I also wanted to briefly note the Historic Tax Credit Growth and Opportunity Act, or HTC GO. This is bipartisan and bicameral legislation introduced by Senators Cassidy and Warner and Representatives LaHood and Swazi that would make positive enhancements to the federal historic tax credit that would increase the credit's effectiveness. And as we've outlined on our previous webinars, for over 50 years, this tax credit program has played a critical role in the rehabilitation of historic buildings, supporting housing and job creation in communities across the nation. And as we await a potential legislative vehicle or opportunity for this legislation to move forward, the preservation community is continuing to build support for the bill by connecting with new supporters in Congress. And that advocacy continues to generate co-sponsors in both the House and the Senate. And at that same action center on our Saving Places website, you'll find even more tools to help with your advocacy on this issue, including sending letters to your senators and representative and accessing state-specific data on successful tax credit projects. And finally, we have also continued to be engaged with our partners in supporting several National Park Service programs, including the African American Civil Rights Network. Its authorization unfortunately expired in January of last year, and the National Park Service is no longer accepting applications to the program. This legislation was a way to establish a voluntary network and official recognition for the people, places, and events involved with the African American civil rights movement. And we are hopeful that we'll be able to share news very soon about legislation that would reauthorize this program. And when we do have that update, we'll be sharing that news in several of our channels. So we encourage you to make sure you're subscribed to the National Trust email newsletters and continue visiting our Action Center, where we'll be distributing information on these and all other advocacy opportunities in the coming weeks and months. This is not an exhaustive list of the many policy issues the trust and the preservation community are engaged with. However, as Lauren mentioned, a lot of us are looking forward to participating in Preservation Advocacy Week next week, where many of these issues are going to be highlighted in conversations with congressional staff. But even if we don't see you in person next week, we hope you'll take advantage of some of these digital resources and continue advocating, even if you're not in DC. Next slide, please. Before we begin our Q&A segment, I did want to acknowledge the questions we've received regarding the White House East Wing and Ballroom. We can post some information in the chat that can be helpful to answer some of that, including background information and resources. We have been regularly posting on our website any updates and statements as they become available, and we hope you'll continue to visit that and subscribe to our newsletter so that you can get that additional information. And earlier at the opening of this webinar, I mentioned that at 4:30 p.m. Eastern today, the National Trust will host a webinar that we invite you to join us for. It's going to feature two National Trust trustees and fellows of the American Institute of Architects, David Scott Parker and Bill Bates. And they will be discussing and sharing design modifications to protect the carefully balanced classical design of the White House. And their insights will help inform your public comments and demonstrate that viable alternatives exist for the East Wing modernization project currently under consideration by the National Capital Planning Commission. And we've posted some more information in the chat in case you missed it at the beginning of the webinar. Next slide, please. So we've reached our question and answer segment, and thank you to everyone who submitted questions prior to the webinar and also using the Q&A function. We don't anticipate being able to answer every question we received due to time constraints, but we'll be working with our Preservation Forum colleagues to answer as many of these as possible. And I'm going to open up the Q&A here. I have a question, I think, for you, Chris, about where people can find some more information about the U.S. Army MOA on 106 reviews, and if there's any effort for amendments related to media companies or any other information you might be able to share there.
Yeah, so I answered the question in the question answer box, but I'm also going to add the link that I shared to the chat. There is a link to the web page that the Army has set up for their program comment where you can review both it and any and all information you could ever want about this program comment. And I'm not aware of any efforts for Section 106 program alternatives focused on media companies at this time.
Great. And Chris, one other question for you. We've had a lot of webinars in the past few months focusing on some of these issues. And in the past, we've talked a lot about kind of the bedrock laws that are so key to preservation work, and that it's not only the National Historic Preservation Act, but also NEPA as well. So I thought maybe it might be helpful for folks to hear a little bit about if there's interplay between those laws, why it's important to our work, and just a little bit of background there and context.
Sure, I'd be happy to talk about that briefly. It's a very complex topic.
Right.
But in the last year, NEPA has undergone significant changes. First, the Council on Environmental Quality's rescission of their implementing regulations for NEPA, which was just finalized in January, represents a seismic change in how federal agencies comply with NEPA. Previously, federal agencies, by and large, used those regulations as the implementing regulations for NEPA. Now that they've been rescinded, there are efforts widely across the federal government for individual agencies to have to write their own regulations to implement NEPA. There was also a major Supreme Court ruling last year in a case called Seven County Infrastructure versus Eagle County. That Supreme Court decision limited the scope of what can be considered under NEPA significantly. So NEPA is now a very different law than it was just this time a year ago. There's a regulation within the Section 106 regulations, 800.8C, I believe, which provides for NEPA substitution and speaks to the coordination of the NHPA and NEPA. Given the recent changes to NEPA, one of the issues that we are bringing to the ACHP during their regulatory revision of the Section 106 regs is that NEPA substitution provision is no longer relevant and valid because NEPA is so different than it was before. So yes, there has always been interplay between the two laws. Section 106 compliance historically was often included in NEPA compliance documents called environmental impact statements. But with the changes to NEPA, it's really uncertain how that interplay will happen going forward, which is why it's so important as part of this regulatory revision initiative for that NEPA coordination regulation to be removed.
And I think we've got several questions here just as a follow-up to that about kind of the process going on at ACHP, how that involves council members. And maybe you could talk a little bit about that because we have some questions about, well, will the public be able to comment on this? How does that work exactly?
Yeah, it was kind of a big bomb to drop in just one slide that the ACHP wants to consider these incredibly important regulations that implement the most important federal historic preservation law. And yes, as of right now, I'm only aware of inquiries that have been sent directly to ACHP members, and I'm not aware of any present opportunities for the public to comment. But as I mentioned in my presentation, in order for any changes proposed by the ACHP to become law, they would have to go through the formal rulemaking process, which does have opportunities for public comment. And the National Trust will absolutely alert the public when there are those opportunities. Again, we sincerely hope that a lot of the things that we've been advocating for years as needed updates to the NHPA can be included in this process. And we're hopeful that some of the other issues identified by Vice Chairman Boyles can be resolved without any significant diminution of NHPA protections.
Thank you for that, Chris. I think that'll be very helpful for people to know. Lauren, I have a question for you. Thank you for the great conversation that you had with Evan about the federal funding landscape. I thought it was interesting that she brought up that we do have a shortened legislative calendar this year and a lot of priorities that we're hoping to take action on. The Trust put together some great resources last year talking about the ways that people can get engaged in some of this work and that there are a lot of ways that people can do things even if they're not in Washington, D.C. So I thought maybe you talk about the kind of interplay between things people can be doing if they're not in Washington, D.C. and some of the ways that we can get those tools to people.
That's exactly right, Pam. Yeah, so election years are always really interesting, midterm election years and presidential election years, just because that means that members of Congress do spend more time back in their home districts, back in their home states. So we always have an August recess every year, regardless of if there's an election or not. But in election years, members of Congress are also back in their states and districts in October as well. So that's a lot of time for them to campaign, but that's also time that our advocates can use to try to set up site visits. It doesn't have to just be in August in the heat of the summer in a lot of places around the country, but it can also be in October as well to try to set up site visits for their elected officials to try to come see what's going on, see the good work that preservationists are doing across the country. And of course, there are other recesses throughout the year as well, kind of a week here and there throughout the year. But it's not just about getting those members of Congress to come visit historic sites or projects that are going on back in the district. Please do remember that your federal elected officials also have state offices and district offices. So that means that they have in addition to having staff like Evan, who you saw earlier working in Washington, D.C., they've got staff back in the district as well. So really good to have those folks who live and work in your districts, in your communities, to come out to those historic sites, to do site visits, to then tell their bosses the good things that are happening back in the district. So as Evan mentioned, it's all about relationship building. It's building those relationships with the staff, both in the district and in Washington throughout the year, not just one time a year. So yeah, there are a lot of great opportunities to kind of build those relationships throughout the year. I think, as you mentioned, we posted some videos last year about how to set up those kinds of site visits. Maybe one of our colleagues will drop that link in the chat where folks can check out that information. If not, we can make it available when this recording goes live. But yeah, there's lots of really wonderful ways to get folks back in to see the things that are happening on the ground back at home, not just in DC.
Thank you for that. And a little bit of a follow-up here, but maybe just remind folks about what the spring might look like and timing for some of these things. There will be a lot of moments, I think, where people can get engaged in terms of the federal budget process and comment period deadlines. Maybe talk a little bit about that so people know what to expect.
Absolutely, yeah. So the spring is really, really busy for appropriation season. This is when kind of everything kicks off, and the way that it typically goes is that the president and the administration their budget request, which I described as just a request. This is how the administration would like for Congress to appropriate dollars to fund the government for the coming fiscal year. So we are expecting the president's budget request to come out really kind of in the next several weeks. Often there's what people call a skinny budget, which is kind of just like the top line priorities, and then the full budget request comes out maybe a week or two after that. Timing is always a little bit, kind of up to when the administration wants to release that. But so that's kind of the opening marker of official appropriation season. We get that president's budget request, and then work really begins in earnest on the House side. So the subcommittee that Evan Johnston's boss, Shelley Pingree, serves on, that subcommittee on the House side, they will begin their work really, very, very, very soon, trying to pull together what they would like to see as priorities, kind of looking at what the president's budget request says, seeing if that's how they want to appropriate. So that work really gets rolling. You'll start to see your members of Congress, they'll open up a portal on their website where it says, if you'd like to make an appropriations request of that office. This is a great way for you to just put in writing, send it in through a portal to your member of Congress to say, hey, it's really important for me for you to make sure the Historic Preservation Fund is funded at a robust level, or at $250 million, and all of the other appropriations requests that we have. So that really starts in earnest on the House side. That goes through the process of subcommittee, then full committee, and then full House vote. A lot of that wraps up before the July 4th recess, really. Usually, well, we'll see. It's hard to give firm dates here with how Congress likes to operate, but lots of times the House work wraps up kind of midsummer, and then kind of the Senate starts that process again. They're kind of working. They're working simultaneously, a little bit behind what the House is doing, but we'll see that same process: subcommittee, full Senate. Lots of times the House and the Senate, have bills that have different numbers. They like to do their own work and prioritize different things. So before that bill can be passed by both chambers and signed into law, it's got to be conferenced out, meaning that everything has to come out the same level. And so, we'll start to see that in the fall. I think Evan mentioned, we may be looking at a continuing resolution. We've been seeing that for many years. Hopefully not another shutdown, but only time will tell on that one.
Thank you so much for that, Lauren. I think we're going to pull up our last slide and just say a quick thank you to everyone who attended the webinar today, and a special thank you to our speakers for sharing their knowledge and expertise. If you have any questions following this webinar, please don't hesitate to contact us. Our email is forum@savingplaces.org, and it's listed on your screen. And as a reminder, this webinar has been recorded and will be shared with you in the coming days from Zoom directly to the email address you registered with. And in addition, all the forum webinars are archived on our YouTube channel, including many of them that have been referenced today. And lastly, on behalf of the GR team, I also want to thank all of you who are attending this webinar for really your continued engagement on so many of the issues we covered today. Your voice and your advocacy in 2026 are truly going to make a difference in ensuring preservation of the amazing historic places in our communities. We're doing a great job. There's a lot of exciting work ahead. Hope everyone has a great week, and thank you again for joining us today.